Alright folks, it's Stan Higgins with Post-X Screw Piles, Manitoba in Northwest Ontario, and owner of Versapile Inc., Helical Pile Contractors. Today I'm doing a low budget info session on building a deck when you have a brand new house. So one of the things that we're looking for when we're trying to figure out whether or not an area is ready for decks is we're looking at is the area getting graded. So once the house is built, then they send out a bunch of skid steers and dirt and they mold it all and get it graded so that it sheds water away from the house. And what they're doing is they're building up the grade, right? So typically you have grade that kind of comes down like this, okay? And this is ground like that. And then we come in very shortly after often and we're putting in piles. And with most houses, you're only down like, you know, a few feet here to the bottom of the house, okay? And so you end up with this, but when they excavated, they came across like that, right? And then oftentimes they came up and then on like an angle. But sometimes, every now and then, you have them come across and they got to go a little further out and then up and maybe on an angle, something like that. What ends up happening is, depending on when the house was built, is sometimes this area is exposed and it's really wet. And so this gets all frozen up here. So this becomes frosty, like that. Okay, you got all this frost in the ground underneath. And then the house gets built, and then they come in and they start backfilling and they start filling it up here. And you get the second frost zone here, right? So you end up with all this frost in here, and then you've got frost in here. So what ends up happening is that if you're installing a pile that's not deep enough, right? So if you're only installing maybe, you know, a 6 or an 8 foot pile in your backyard, oftentimes what could happen is that you end up anchoring the pile somewhere in this zone here, or you end up on top of this second frost line. And then in the springtime, when everything thaws out, then this gives way and you end up with a deck that ends up pretty wonky. So if you are living in a new house, I would say definitely make sure that you know when this was backfilled. If it was backfilled anytime, late December onward, then you're going to want to make sure that whoever you're bringing in to install screw piles for your deck, that you're bringing them in and they're installing piles that are long enough to get nice and below any frozen soil. And that's going to take a little bit of extra time for them to install if they're installing in the spring, or you could just wait until probably June in order to get these done. And the reason I say June when normally the frost is out of the ground before that is that down here this frost is insulated with all the ground on top of it. So this is gonna thaw out a little bit later on in the season. So if you're looking at doing your piles, you've got a freshly excavated area, you want to make sure that you know how far down they excavated, and you want to ensure that you have a pile that's deep enough and that it gets below that second frost line. What'll end up happening if you're an installer is you'll know this is happening when all of a sudden you're going down into, like in Winnipeg anyways, it's clay soil, and you're proceeding down and then it starts to flat spin. We don't have refusal like a till or bedrock or something that's so hard that it would create flat spin in and around our area. So it's just important that if you do come across that you got to think about a potential for a second frost line. So just something to think about if you have a new house. You want to think about this as well if you're doing your concrete steps off the front. That's another important consideration, is just making sure that you've got a pile that gets below any excavated area, because this soil here is going to be settling for years and years to come, and it's not going to be great soil for bearing any load. So you want to make sure that you get below that area. Thanks so much and have a great year.